You see, the interest in modern architecture in India, particularly in the West, has primarily been focused on either Le Corbusier and the work he did there, or on Lucan, pretty much the two, name architects, one Swiss, one American. But the work that I'm going to talk about and show you is virtually unknown, actually even in India now, because the generations that have come after the 70s have had no access, because we've had no proper publications, exhibitions, there's no proper record of Indian modernism at all. And that's what I'm going to concentrate on, not on the Corbu and Lucan. I was at MIT as an undergrad, and my father had graduated. I'm going to actually talk about him in the beginning of the talk. He graduated from MIT in architecture in 1944. He was one of the first Indians to study architecture in the US, because most architects from India used to go to Britain because of our colonial connection. He was born in 1915, and I realized that this year was his centenary. And I'm going to show you a lot of the photographs that he did himself. He was very keen and a very good photographer. They've never been shown, and I might show them at some point this year in India. They're his dance pictures from Carnegie Hall. My grandmother was a dancer, as was my mother and as my sister was. And she danced in the 1940s in Little Carnegie. And my dad had graduated from MIT. At MIT, his biggest influence was Walter Gropius, actually, who was in Harvard. But he worked with Gropius. Gropius got him a set of jobs in New York when he graduated with Marcel Breuer, Konrad Wachsmann, and later he worked with Eli Kahn also. But Konrad Wachsmann was his longest stint. This was 1945, 46. Anyway, he goes back to India in 1946, and he joins the state government of Bengal. This was just before India had been partitioned. So he became a civic architect, and this was his very first project he did. Now he studies with Gropius. He's a strict Bauhausian, but the very first project he does in India is a memorial to Gandhi. And here he goes back to classical symbolism from our religious architecture, but creates a modernist stylized memorial on a ghat, which are traditional riverbank ghats with steps. And this was Gandhi Ghat. It was the first memorial to Gandhi after his assassination. 1940, Gandhi's assassinated in 1948, the beginning of 1948. This opens in 1949. And it was opened by Jawaharlal Nehru, who's going to figure quite a bit in this talk. My dad told me that when Nehru came to open this, he saw the monument, he loved it, and he asked loudly that who is the architect? And he said that at that time in India, the word architect was hardly known, because under the British, they had set up this whole system of military engineering, civic engineering. So people who built buildings were engineers, and actually they were engineers, a lot of the Brits, other than of course the Latvians, etc., doing the grand projects in the cities. But in common parlance, architect was hardly known. So he was taken aback. He called my father, met him, saying, "Who are you? What's your background? Come to Delhi because we need people like you." So he was directly recruited from Bengal. That's him in his studio in Calcutta. As I said, an ardent photographer and loved taking pictures of both himself and his wife and family.
That's a self-portrait?
Rolleiflex with self-timer. He comes to Delhi. Now, the situation in Delhi is quite unusual because We've just become independent in 1947. Lutyens' classical imperial Delhi has been built, never quite got finished because the war came, money ran out. That city was built outside the old city in the ruins of the 6 earlier cities of Delhi. There was this big barren land, empty, rocky, outcropping land, huge area, which was quite empty. So when the capital shifts to Delhi, the British bring it back in 1912, there's still a lot of open land left in 1947. And a lot of institutional building is necessary for the new India. And what is happening in Delhi is people are coming from all over India, bureaucrats, to come and work in the new government. But at the same time, it becomes a magnet for artists, architects for building, artists, dancers, musicians. It becomes the center of what we now call Nehruvian India, or the Nehruvian model. And it happened naturally because it was the capital. But this was the University Grants Commission building, which was done in 1954. When there's not a lot of money to build, the buildings are fairly simple, cheaply built. This is 1957. A memorial, a tomb actually, of Maulana Azad, who was one of our great leaders from the independence movement, a Muslim leader. And this was built in front of the great mosque, Shah Jahan's mosque in Old Delhi. And here too, my father goes back to the Mughal roots in this case. He takes the arch of the entrance of the Mughal mosque, but he makes a double cross-barrel vault out of thin concrete. He'd studied engineering, by the way, at MIT, so he had a great advantage because he had worked a lot with concrete here before going back to India. So he was like, even in the Gandhi Ghat with the big cantilever, it was because of his engineering that he worked with the engineers, to persuade them to do that. Similarly here with this thin shell. This again, Nehru loved this. Now in the meantime, he's doing housing, he's doing official building, again very simple and straightforward. But in 1961, he's asked by Nehru to do a memorial building for the arts and a big gallery in memory of Rabindranath Tagore. These halls were being built in every state capital of India, and this again had been initiated by Nehru. And here you see him with the plans of what was called Rabindra Bhavan, explaining them to Jawaharlal. The first building he had done, the first design for this building was like an office building, and Nehru saw it and freaked out. He said, "This is terrible, it doesn't have the spirit of Tagore at all, and what have you done?" And father came back like, tense and hysterical, saying, "What do I do?" And Nehru said, "You've done the Gandhi Ghat, you've done the Maulana Azad, these buildings which have a local spirit. Why can't," he said, "but I've never done a large-scale institutional building like that. Those have been memorials." So there was this big struggle, and he actually, with Nehru, evolved what became a classic design, which is for the first time using jalis, the trellis work, stone work. This was 1961. And these are all his photographs, by the way.
Can you go back? What are the materials for the
Here?
exterior?
Here, on this one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the wall on the left is granite, quartzite rather, stone, which comes from the Tughlaq buildings of Delhi, inspired by that. The bands under the louvers are fire tile. What do you call them? That you use in fireplaces. It's a porous ceramic tile, slightly yellowish, and brick. But I think you don't see the brick here.
Yeah.
What is the building's still called Rabindra Bhabha?
Yeah, it's the Lalit Kala Academy. This is
yeah.
the three academies of the arts: literature, fine arts, and music and dance.
1961.
61, yeah. And this is the interior of the gallery. Unfortunately, it has been upgraded, which I had a huge fight over, and it's pretty ruined from the inside. But it shows you the kind of aspiration of the time. This is a government office building. This is 1967. After his 1961 building, his style changes. And you get a little more, much more expression coming in. These are flats. Did you stay here, Zarina? You were in the other flats. External affairs.
No, we were at the, in 61.
In
We
external
came from
affairs.
Bangkok, yes. On Kasturba Gandhi Marg.
This is also that, but this is the Curzon Road Hostels. This is 1967. And these, as I just posted this on Facebook, they're two Gropius architects here. In the foreground is Achyut Kanvinde, who graduated about 5 years after my dad from Harvard. And this is the ICCR building. The ones with the curves are Kanvinde, and through that in the back is my dad's income tax building. And there's a gap of about 12 years between these buildings. The Kanvinde was built first, the other one later. This is the other one. This is all my dad's photography. This was as it's coming to completion. Now, the milieu, the scene in Delhi at the time, we had this wonderful magazine called Design, which started in 1956, edited by crazy Sardar, Patwan Singh, who was a son of building contractors, and he had actually started a magazine called Indian Builder, which was for the building trade in Bombay. And he came to my dad in Delhi in 1955, wanting to publish one of his buildings from Calcutta. And my dad met him and said that, why don't you start a design magazine, not just building, for the building trade. And this evolved into Design. It was a magazine which was incredibly important, very adventurous, beautifully designed. A lot of these covers, some of these covers are by Dilip Chowdhury, who was one of the great graphic designers at the time, completely forgotten now. This was the editorial board. And this was an active editorial board. And all of these people actually wrote for the magazine. And what I wanted to emphasize was at this moment of India's independence, in those first 10, 15 years, there was an incredible cosmopolitanism, and there was a modern design confidence which seemed to have died in 1965 or so. And you had people like this, like Isamu coming through Delhi, etc. And they were dealing with these designers and architects on a completely equal level. There was nothing exotic or poor country, third worldish about this. There was a great, back and forth. And they were all particularly fascinated by our handcrafts and the handwork which was being done. Which had also influenced, of course, Corbu and Jean Array in Chandigarh. That was Batwan Singh, and he's having a conference with Rahman. And this was his home, which had been added on to in his old ancestral home by a young Canadian architect called Luc Duran, who's still alive in Montreal. And that chimney and fireplace was done by my father, and I think that's a Noguchi lamp over there. These are more covers of Design. And Design covered the arts, it had dance, it had music, it had painting, ceramics.
What was the circulation around? Do you know?
I don't know the official circulation, but it would have been in the hundreds. But it went across India. You know, that was still a time when the design architecture community was still quite small. But there was a lot of interchange, and also a lot between the arts in those years. This, I think, is a mural by Satish Gujral from Janare's building, the Gandhi Bhavan in Chandigarh, cover of Design. A feature on the chairs by Janare, inspired by Indian beds, Nevar, rope beds, beddings. This is 1958. So this is the kind of work which is in circulation, which is being seen, which is being discussed by designers and architects at the time. And many of these chairs are still in Patwan Singh's house. He died a few years ago, but the original Janare, they haven't yet sold at Christie's, but will probably someday. Article on textiles by Riten Mazumdar, who was a great textile designer, came out of Shantiniketan Tagore's University in Bengal. Highly experimental designer who worked with our handcrafts, with block printing, with tie-dye. Huge influence. And a lot of the buildings you're going to see are actually filled with Riten's work. His cushion covers, his wall hangings, yeah. And this whole period, by the way, is Zarina's period, and it's Zarina's aesthetic, and she's very linked to it.
And we also wore his clothes.
Yeah. This is a cover of Design Magazine Annual. This was done by Luc Durand, the same young Canadian designer I spoke about, who came back to India in 2012. And this is him in the lobby of the Sheila Cinema in Old Delhi, which was designed by my father. So they had worked together. My dad did the structure, and Luke did this lobby mural, which has been fairly well maintained until even now. That's the Sheila Theatre. These are my photographs, by the way. And the theatre is still in this shape. It's been luckily maintained quite well. This is 1961 also.
The screening room right above us.
Those are the seats.
Yeah.
That's the underneath of the rake. It's still one of the best screens in Delhi, by the way. It was the first 70 mm widescreen theatre in India, and it opened with Solomon and Sheba.
Todd A.O. screen.
Those are the stairs. And that is the gentleman who designed, I think, that end of your building. That's Philip Johnson. Photographs by my dad, who took him to Chandigarh in 1965. These have never been seen. They're 35 mm negatives, which I'm slowly scanning and bringing up. And that's also Johnson in Chandigarh. But this was the kind of, Bucky Fuller was hanging out, Philip Johnson, all kinds of people coming in and out and partaking of what was happening in India. This is Marg magazine, which is a very important magazine, which started in the late 1940s. And the name Marg actually is Architectural Research Group. I've forgotten what the M was for.
This is Mulk Raj Anand.
Yeah, started by Mulk Raj Anand, who was a left-wing writer, came out of the progressive writers group. But that's a whole other story, which links to my other talks tomorrow. This was an issue on contemporary architecture, and you see Chandigarh in this. But in the inside, Marg was also, the design was very lively, the graphics. This is a feature of the India International Center. This issue is 1965, which was designed by Joseph Allen Stein, who had come out of the Bay Area and had moved to India in the early 50s because of Richard Neutra. Nehru had asked Richard Neutra to help get people to come and teach in Bengal, in the Bengal Engineering College, and Neutra got Stein, who had left California because of politics and the McCarthyism and had moved to France. Stein relocated. He was a student of Saarinen, Eliel Saarinen, I think Cranbrook also, had also worked with Neutra, but had a big Bay Area design aesthetic. He built a lot in the Bay Area before coming to India, but he ended up living in India the rest of his life. So this was Mark. This is Sunil Jana, who was a Communist Party member, photographed for the Communist Party in the 1940s, and I had done a big show of his in New York, 1998, in a funky space on Lower Broadway. That was him in the show. But he became a very important industrial photographer. This is in Bengal and Orissa. He lived in Calcutta after being thrown out of the Communist Party. He was from Calcutta. He had worked very closely with Margaret Burke-White in the 40s. She had sought him out because he was the most famous photographer in India then. And they had a very strange and curious working relationship. The only time I know when two photographers actually photographed at the same moment, because he didn't have a flash sync on his camera. And they went into huts photographing famine victims in the south. And she would set up her camera on a tripod with her big bulb flashes, and he would stay on the side and open his shutter and say, "Okay, Peggy," and she would fire her camera and his film would get exposed. So at literally the same instant, they made two different photographs. And I'd shown those together in New York at that time. So you can see an influence of Burke-White. This is done in the 50s. This was the big new industry which was being built. The steel plants, the jute plants, the big power stations in India. This is what Nehru called the new temples of modern India. So it was a very important moment, and Jana became the kind of documenter of that. These are all from about 1952 till 1958.
The belching smokestacks are a source of pride
at that time, yeah. Before, this was, this was like the Stalinist, as it was in America actually, with even with Burke-White's pictures of the Peck Dam and industry. So in a sense, this is a similar moment, but happening 2-3 decades later in India.
Do you know if these tended to be commissioned by the corporation,
Yes.
by Nehru, by...
No, by the factories, by the
They're
corporations.
truly industrial photography.
Yeah, it's truly industrial photography, and this was one of the few times he actually made a living doing photography.
Mm.
Now this is actually Madan Mahata brought a dummy of a book that I hope to publish. Madan was a photographer in Delhi who came from a studio photography family who had studios in Pakistan, what became Pakistan, in Punjab, in Kashmir, and in Delhi. And he was one of the few photographers who actually went to England for proper training. Almost all the other photographers picked up, their craft on the job or apprenticing with other photographers. We had no photographic training in India, even in the art schools, most of which had been set up by the British under fairly standard British art school traditions. Madan goes to England in the comes back to Delhi in 1955. And is the only photographer who has a Linhof camera with shifts. perfectly set up to do architectural photography. But he's also a photographer who happens to be in Delhi, where all these architects from all over India are gathering. My dad comes from Calcutta, Joe Stein comes from Calcutta, moves to Delhi. Architects come from Bombay. A whole slew come down from Chandigarh, young architects who had worked with Pierre Jeanneret and Corbu and Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew. They all come down and establish their practices in Delhi, because Delhi is where the big building is now happening. Madan happens to be there at the time and happens to be the only person with the camera that can really photograph architecture properly, but also has an incredible eye. And I had seen his photographs as I grew up as a child, because everyone got their film processed by him. He photographed my mother, who was a dancer. So, it was, the whole family was linked to him. And in 2011, I said to him, Madan, I really think it's time that we do an exhibition of your architectural photographs. But he had started giving the negatives away to the architects. And I freaked out. I said, please don't do that. Keep the negatives, let's do. And it's also because of technology. The negatives were old. Gelatin silver had become impossible to do anymore. I persuaded him to, get high-res, proper scans done. They were cleaned up. We had to do digital prints, but really beautiful prints on barita paper, as close to his gelatin silver as possible, which he finally approved of. And he asked me, he said, who would be interested in this work? And I said, Madan, just listen to me. And there was a photography gallery which had been set up in Delhi called Photoing by a young lady, Devika Daulat Singh, who agreed to do the show. So it was things fell into place in 2012. Madan died last year, but I'm very happy we did the show when he was alive. And I'll get into, this was the show as it hung. It was the first time that an architectural photography show had been done in India. And the architects who were still alive, whose work was on show when they came to see the show in Delhi, each one had seen their own projects photographed by Madan, but had not seen the work of their contemporaries. So even for them in 2012, it was a revelation, and they were all going around saying, oh my God, that, this is the work we did. It was like a sudden, re-emergence of a practice that even they had not been aware of. This is Sapru House. This was the kind of building that was being done in Delhi in the early 1950s, mid-50s, which is harking back to a kind of Indian tradition, slightly looking at Lutyens, but without the sophistication of Lutyens. Baker is a slightly different kettle of fish. Buddhist arches, Chaitya dome on the top. That's the Ashoka Hotel, which was a big government building. Both of these buildings were done by Bombay architects. And you can see that influence of that kind of Bombay aesthetic in these buildings. Now, the other unusual thing about the architects who landed up in Delhi, like this is Achyut Kanvinde, this is the structure of the Gandhi Bhavan in the early this is about 1965. Kanvinde was American trained, my dad was American trained, Charles Correa was American trained, Pilu Modi American trained, Ranjit Sabiki American trained. Suddenly there's this concentration in Delhi of an American training, a lot of which was connected to the Bauhaus or the Mies traditions, very different from what was being taught in the JJ School of Art and Architecture in Bombay, which had this British classicism. And that's very unusual in Delhi. It became a center of this kind of experimentation. Now, what happens because of the architects are forced to work with fairly low budgets, because India at that time is still not, rich enough to do fancy building, but they innovate with the materials on hand. That's the Claridge's hotel. This is the Indian Institute of Technology. Now, this is part of the building of the new India with the big science institutions connected to MIT. This is done by J.K. Chowdhury, who you can see quite clearly came out of Chandigarh. But he develops his own language using poured concrete, quite refined and not quite as sculptural as what Corbu was doing there. That's the interior of the IIT, and you'll see the Jean inspired chairs, the ramps. This is all IIT, J.K. Chowdhury. This is early 1960s up until 67, 66 when the complex is being built. One thing you do notice that the staircases are where the architects take off, because those are the places where they can really let their structure and their imagination go wild. These are all IIT. These were the lecture halls inside the IIT, all of which had these pebble and rough cast walls separating them from the administrative blocks. Shivnath Prasad, who never did work or study with Corbu. This is the Sri Ram Center, a theatre, an arts complex. This is under construction. This is 1967-68. This is the British Council, mural by Howard Hodgkin, building by Charles Correa. This is on the left. On the wall you see hangings by Riten Mazumdar. On the left is John Bissell, who is an American, also very important in design terms in India. He was the roommate of Luc Durand, the architect you saw earlier. John had come from Connecticut and moved to India to look at handicrafts. He ended up moving to India, ended up starting a weavers collaborative called Fab India, which worked with handloom fabrics. Is that Fab India? Are you wearing Fab India?
Yes, the shirt.
The shirt is Fab India, okay. Will you take your jacket off, Sarina? We can see the shirt.
Well, it's just very simple shirt. I noticed it's Fab India. And
So-
we'll see the label.
Yeah. So John, actually this is Fab India too. So John became very important because he started, and the furniture, actually this shot is actually of the furniture. I forgot to mention the furniture. Inspired by Jean Array and other designers, a whole bunch of designers started making furniture in Delhi. This is the furniture by Mini Boga, which is all teak, very minimal lines, again using jute, rope as seating. So this, and those wall dividers are also Mini Boga. This was the culture of the time, along with the ceramicists who were working. It was all quite integral to the modernism of the buildings. So that's John, that's Shona Ray, who is a great figure in the revival of handlooms and handicrafts in India, and that's Bharti Sharma, whose husband was an architect who you'll see later on. This is Riten in his own studio and in his own house, which was designed by Charles Correa. So you see the threads linking. And that's Achyut Kanvinde in his own house.
So this is in Delhi?
This is in Delhi. And that house is still exactly like that.
Wow.
Wow.
Still in the family's
Yeah.
possession?
His son runs the office now.
Is most of what you're showing us still extant? Still
A lot of it is extant. It doesn't look like this anymore
Yeah.
because it's covered by trees, and a lot of it is rotted. And I'll show you some buildings which are no longer extant.
Okay.
This is Ram Sharma, architect, in his own house. And it was amazing that Madan actually captured these people also in their own settings.
Yeah, what was the context for the photography of these architects in their
He was
homes?
photographing their own homes, which they had designed.
For who?
For them.
Got it.
Yeah. So this was all commissioned work.
Mm-hmm.
So,
In this case,
for
commissioned by
instance,
the
the IIT, J.K. Chowdhury would go to him, and he photographed their models and their drawings also, because you know we didn't have things to copy large drawings in those
Right.
days. So here you see that's mini Boga furniture. Those cushions are retained. I mean, it's almost like a plug-in, you know, standard. Zarina's giggling.
There was like a checklist.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Painting by Paramjit Singh on the wall
Yes.
in the back. But this was the aesthetic, which was quite actually linked to a tradition of handicrafts that had come from Gandhi down through Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay into Delhi modern. And in fact, I think MoMA had a textile exhibition in the 1950s, which is also very much part of this. How am I doing for time? Okay. This is Joseph Allen Stein. This is his industrial work, which is very little known. This is the Escorts factory. And Stein had this fascination for doing these very cheap and lightweight roof systems, which were quite interesting. For each factory, he developed different structural systems, which were these complicated paraboloids, really wonderful, using as much natural light as he could bring in. This is also early 1960s. This is the Escorts. They make tractors, motorcycles. This is no longer extant. This is the American International School done by Stein on a beautiful site where he retained the natural landscape and the natural rocks which actually came into the building and into the classrooms. Sadly, the Americans have torn this down and built horrendous functional space. But this was a great classic. Again, those roofs, those cheap roofs. And that's Stein there on the extreme left with his Rolleiflex. This is the staircase of the Ford Foundation, and that's Stein coming up with his bald head. And that's the photographer's feet. That's Madan Mahata. And that hanging is Riten Mazumdar. This is also the Ford Foundation. Here, this is about 1965.
And this still exists.
Yeah,
And all the fabrics were from Fab India.
yeah. The chairs, the
The
fabrics of the chairs,
upholstery.
yeah, were from Fab India, which was all handloom. This still exists and it's in pretty good shape.
And
Even
Ford
with the
still has some-
furniture? With the furniture?
I
from that?
actually haven't seen if the furniture is there. Some of the furniture from the other building, which I'll just show you, is actually been changed, which is a bit of a shame.
And Ford still has an active program in
Yes, they've just been attacked though by our democratically elected totalitarian government because a woman I work with actually quite closely has been fighting for justice for the Gujarat riots, the sectarian riots in 2002, in which our esteemed current Prime Minister is the prime accused. And they have attacked the Ford Foundation for giving her funding. It's become a big issue, and even Obama has raised it. So it's a hot issue right now. This is 1972, the Hall of Nations done by Raj Rewal, which was design-wise a very radical project, a space frame structure, which couldn't be built in steel because we didn't have enough steel, it was too expensive, but it was done, handcrafted in poured concrete, engineered by one of the great engineers, actually one of the great engineers of the world, Mahinder Raj, who engineered a lot of these buildings, who's still alive, late 80s now. This is the interior of the Hall of Nations. And that's Rival standing there in the shade.
We need an architectural tour next trip, for sure.
And this building is also under threat now because they want to tear it down and build like a fancy convention center. So there's a huge, and with this government, it might happen any day.
What part of the city is it in?
This is in the Trade Fair complex. It's next to the old fort, the Crafts Museum, which also might be torn down, which is done by Charles Correa.
Pragati Maidan?
Pragati Maidan. So these were a whole set of these pyramids which he had built, smaller ones with these ramps connecting them, and there's one large one. It became a very famous structure used for industrial. And this is the interior of the Nehru Pavilion in the same complex done by Raj Rewar to house the exhibition on Jawaharlal Nehru done by Charles and Ray Ames after Nehru died. It was an exhibition, I think, which opened at Lever House, in the lobby of Lever House here many years ago. But this became the permanent spot. The building was built for this exhibition. This is again now under threat because this government is demolishing the legacy of Nehru. So a lot of what you're seeing may be gone pretty quickly.
It came to Paris also.
Yeah, I traveled in many parts of the world. This is Kuldeep Singh, the NDMC building, all poured concrete. That's the building in the back, which was a kind of tribute to the Jantar Mantar Observatory, which you see in the foreground, which is 18th century. This is the Syrian church, Ranjit Sabiki. And housing by Ranjit Sabiki in Delhi. Housing became a very important part of many of these architects' works. That's the India International Center, done by Joseph Stein. And this is the interior. This furniture is no longer there, unfortunately, nor the light fixtures. So it's lost a bit of its patina. This is the Baha'i temple, which is done by an Iranian architect. And that's my dad. That's the Hindustan Times building. A few pictures of what I've been doing, which I'm going to end with. This is a small picture. This is Moshe Safdie, a huge complex that he did outside Chandigarh, which is kind of a tribute to Chandigarh, the Khalsa heritage complex in Anandpur Sahib, which is a very important religious site for the Sikhs. So this is a museum and a library, cultural center for Sikh heritage.
So when was that done?
This was finished about 3 years ago.
Oh, it's quite recent.
Yeah, it's very
Has
recent.
he built before in India?
No. This was his first building. And it's huge, the complex. I'm just showing you this one little thing, but I have a blog with tons of pictures. I shot 3 times for him there during construction over maybe 5 years. These are new buildings. This is Raj Reval's Parliament Library Complex, which is built next to the Parliament which was done by Howard Baker. This is a partly sunken building, and I'll show you so that it doesn't fight with the existing architecture of the Parliament. Done with concrete and sandstone, buff and tan sandstone. This is finished maybe 8 years ago. These are the domes, and that's Howard Baker's Parliament in the back. And this is the upper level, which is like a roof garden with these glass domes and concrete domes.